really excited to introduce our first speaker. Amber M. Hamilton is a doctoral candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Her research focuses on the intersection of race, racism, and technology. Her dissertation, titled Doing Race Online, an exploration of race making on social media platforms, explores the meaning making around race and racism that occurs on digital platforms. Amber has worked as a PhD research intern at IBM Research, Microsoft Research, and the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Please welcome Amber M. Hamilton, who will present her talk titled Platforming Race, Examining Racial Ideologies on Social Media Platforms.
Thank you, Herman, for that really great introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen with you all. I can see Herman and Jackson. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen okay? Okay, great. Thanks so much. Okay, so thank you all for being here today. And thank you to the organizers for setting up this really amazing panel and putting us all in conversation with one another. So I'm going to be presenting some work today titled Platforming Race, Examining Racial Ideologies on Social Media Platforms. And so this work is a part of my broader dissertation project, and I'm really excited to share it all with you today. So this work began for me last summer after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police on May 25th. And so amid international protests for racial justice, corporations released statements condemning racism, offering donations, and in some cases uttering that Black Lives Matter. And so what was interesting to me during that time was that there was this flurry of public statements from tech and social media platforms, such as this one from TikTok, which expresses their commitment to diversity among their users and creators. It expresses solidarity with the Black community. And it acknowledges their commitment to fostering a space where, quote, everyone is seen and heard. And so this statement is really similar to what I saw across a range of statements from corporations. So, and so I saw these statements and I realized that what was happening was really unique, right? So in an industry that is sort of notorious for not talking about issues of race and racism, this was a moment in which all of these companies felt compelled to respond to this moment of racial upheaval. And so I decided to capture as much of this as I could to understand just how tech companies talked about race and racism, and then what these statements could reveal about how they thought about these issues. And so to this end, I collected 195 documents from 25 companies. So this includes Facebook, Microsoft, Grindr, Twitch, Uber, Airbnb, and others. I would try to be as inclusive as possible in my selection of companies to capture the breadth of the industry. And so I collected these statements as they were released on social media platforms and company websites. And then I analyzed them using content analysis, which is a term that's used to describe an array of analytic techniques that range from impressionistic analysis to systematic textual analysis. And it is a common methodological approach in qualitative research. And so to do this content analysis, I used Atlas TI, which is a qualitative analysis for a deep textual analysis. And I coded these documents iteratively, meaning that my coding strategy emerged as I saw patterns in the data. And so I coded for terms that I collectively refer to as diversity discourse, right? And so these are terms like inclusion and diversity, solidarity, and belonging. I also coded for use of terms like race, racism, and racial inequality. I coded for references to the criminal justice system, and so this includes mentions of police, but of larger systems like mass incarceration. And then finally, I looked for references to algorithmic bias and an acknowledgement that the algorithms that many of these companies use and have cause disproportionate harm to Black communities and other communities of color. And so I want to walk you through my findings, particularly as they relate to the concept of diversity discourse and topics of race and racism. And so, as I stated, when I use the term diversity discourse, I'm referring to a slate of words and phrases that conjure ideas related to an inclusive, multiracial society, right? So it's a language that extols the virtues of difference and celebrates diversity as a value. And so I don't suggest that diversity discourse is in general a bad thing. But I do suggest that using the linguistic moves of diversity discourse allows people to vaguely talk about difference in ways that don't address systemic inequalities or speak to the differential life outcomes that different racial groups experience, particularly in the US context. And so this example is from a statement released by Airbnb that reads, "We believe in a world where everyone belongs," right? And so while well-intentioned, this statement reduces racism and inequality to people belonging in a multiracial world, right? And a statement like this really does nothing to address the fact that Black people and other people of color experience systemic inequality and racism. It simply relies on the happy talk of diversity discourse to maintain the facade of racial inclusivity. And, and within this discourse of diversity is this pervasive framework of racecraft, which is a concept developed by Barber and Karen Fields to describe the mental terrain and pervasive beliefs about race and racism in America. And so Fields outline many aspects of the concept, but their basic proposition is that the very idea of race arises out of racist practices rather than biological realities. And they suggest racecraft as a conjurer's trick that transforms racism into race, that leaves Black people in view while removing white people from the stage. And so there are many features of racecraft, but the transformation of the aggressive act of racism into the mere category of race is a central feature. And so I want to show you what this looks like in practice. So take the statement, Black Southerners were segregated because of the color of their skin. This is an example from Fields and Fields' book on racecraft. So this is a perfectly natural sentence in the American lexicon, and many of you may not even see an issue with it. But the problem with a sentence like this is that segregation disappears as the doing of segregationists and then reappears as a trait of the segregated. If the sentence reduces segregation to something that happens because Black people are Black rather than the reality, which is that centuries of anti-Black racism created a legal system in which Black people were relegated to second-class citizenship. And so the way the sentence should read is, Black Southerners were segregated because of racist ideas and practices enacted by white people in the South. This version of the sentence foregrounds the aggressive policies and practices of white Southerners that subjugated Black people. And so in this sentence, racism, not race, is the problem. And so I want to show you some examples of racecraft from the statements that I collected. So the first is a statement from Instagram, which reads, quote, "These efforts won't stop the disparities people may experience solely on the basis of race." So in this statement, you can see that the company is blaming the disparities people face on their platform on the racial category that they are assigned to, rather than the racist actions that actually cause the disparity. And we can see something similar in this statement from Airbnb, which states, quote, "We were deeply troubled by stories of travelers who were turned away by Airbnb hosts during the booking process because of the color of their skin." The company is collapsing the experiences of being denied booking into a problem that is caused by skin color rather than the racist actions of hosts who are choosing to discriminate. And finally, the statement from TikTok reads, quote, "We hope to stimulate open dialogue about race and inspire everyone to take steps to learn, listen, and heal." Right? So in this, we can see the company is stating that they want to stimulate an open dialogue about race, which suggests that racial categories themselves are the problem rather than, again, racism. And so taken together, we can see that these companies are shifting the aggressive acts of racism into race, which obscures the reality that racist actions and not racial categories cause discrimination, right? And this sleight of hand allows platforms to absolve themselves of the responsibility of racism. And it also perpetuates this myth that abolishing racial categories will lead to a post-racial society in which we can overcome racism through colorblindness and happy talk. And so why does this matter, right? It matters because the language people use to talk about racism shapes how they understand what's happening and which solutions sound appropriate. And so when racism is talked about in surface level ways, we get surface level solutions that don't address the structures and systems that perpetuate racism. But when we talk about racism in ways that implicate systems of power and axes of oppression, then we can develop solutions to those problems and work toward abolishing racism. And in these sessions focused on AI for social good, we need to think about how good AI can be if the people designing them don't even understand how social inequality functions, right? We need to demand that the engineers and the computer scientists that create these algorithms understand issues of racism, misogyny, transphobia, and other axes of oppression that exist, and understand how then biases get embedded into technological systems. And we also need to demand that the creators of these systems are representative of the world in which we live, right? Because we can't create equitable systems when there's inequity within the ranks of those making the systems. And so I don't mean to sound like a techno-pessimist, right? I do think it possible to create artificial intelligence and other technological systems that we can harness for social good. But as my work has shown, we need those systems to be created with an eye toward racial equity and justice in order to be most effective. Thank you all so much. And I'm really looking forward to discussing my work further in the panel discussion and hearing from this other amazing group of scholars that will follow me.
Should I just go ahead and jump in?
So I think Herman is muted.
Oh, okay.
Always happened to me. Thank you, Amber, for sharing that thought-provoking presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Brooklyn Gibson. Brooklyn Gibson is an Illinois ACLS Drive Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow in the Digital Humanities at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Gibson is an interdisciplinary communication scholar whose area of research include digital and social media environments, Black feminist, digital and technology studies, and the intersection of race, gender, social media, and power. Her work examines how social media platforms facilitate civic engagement within Black communities. Her current research takes an intersectional approach to analyzing how anti-Black discourses manifest themselves in everyday discursive exchanges within Black social media spaces. And with that, I'm inviting everyone to welcome Dr. Brooklyn Gibson to present her talk.
Thank you so much, Herman. I was sharing a little bit with Herman earlier that I am not feeling my best today, but I am going to put on my best face and push through this presentation. Let me just share my screen, which is always a struggle. You would think a year and a half into Zoom life, I would have figured it out by now. Okay, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so honored to be here today and to be recognized for my work, as projects like this have not always been as legible in the academy. I'm thankful to the professors who precede me, such as Dr. Sophia Noble, Dr. Andre Brock, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Dr. Meredith Broussard, Dr. Anna Everett, and a host of others who have provided models for me and my work, and also paved a way for this type of research to be possible. Today, I hope to foreground the importance of intersectionality as an analytical framework in critical internet studies via the presentation of a slice of my dissertation research. My dissertation takes an intersectional approach to analyzing how white supremacist discourses circulate within a particular subset of the Black digital public sphere. And in this project, I chose to focus on white supremacist discourses because I thought that this would be a really good way to underscore the insidious nature of white supremacy. Typically, when we think of racial dynamics in the United States, we tend to pit, whiteness and Blackness at polar opposites, and we have them at different ends of the spectrum. So I felt like using these two identity groups that are typically viewed as diametrically opposed to one another and showing similarities in discourse within certain subsets may help to illustrate just how insidious like white supremacist ideology is. As Eduardo Bonilla Silva stated in his research, Racism Without Racists, many elide the severity of racism, presenting it as something that other people do or are just those bad people. However, racism and anti-Blackness is such an insidious thing that it can manifest in all of us, even those who embody identities that it vilifies the most harshly. I felt that by moving the margin to the center in this study, I hope to illustrate some hard truths about racism and anti-Blackness. In my dissertation project, I chose to focus on the representation of Black women and how they are discussed within this very particular subset of Black social media spaces, which I would argue is kind of in proximity to the white manosphere. The Black manosphere has been traditionally so far under theorized within comm studies. And so I hope to kind of bring that forward and nuance the conversation about who bad actors are online. So white supremacist ideology is not the sole domain of white men, although they are the producers of it and the main facilitators of this discourse. Their hegemonic positioning within American culture has made it so that their ideologies have permeated society, affecting all, including those that are most harshly attacked by these discourses. And so this research forms a baseline for understanding how these white patriarchal discourses present themselves in discussions of Black women online within the subset of the Black digital public sphere, and how these platforms may facilitate the spread of gendered anti-Blackness. So to this end, my first task was to establish and I'm going to be talking about networked misogynoir, which is a theory I kind of...
I wanted to, sorry to quickly interrupt, the slides are not changing. Are they meant to change?
No, it's fine. It's fine. I was just about... Thank you. So networked misogynoir is a concept that I present in this presentation, in my dissertation. And so that's why we're titled this. And I hadn't advanced the slides yet, but I'm about to. All right, so my first task was to establish an emergent coding scheme from a sample of 400 memes. From a set of meme aggregator pages within the Black digital public sphere to categorize how these groups discuss Black women. And then I analyze these memes using intersectionality and critical technocultural discourse analysis. And now my slides actually should be advancing. The study revealed that not only are Black women vilified in these intra-group discussion, but themes within this discourse are also consistent with the controlling images framework of Black womanhood. This framework was articulated most prominently by Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins, and it's used to describe the stereotypes and tropes of Black women created during slavery by slaveholders, and a few of them created in the 20th century to justify the subjugation of Black women. And these images were also propagated through mainstream American popular media. And so there's a lot of theorization about how these tropes continue to circulate via mainstream media and radio, television, film, plays, everything. But we haven't had as many people so far talk about the way in which it circulates through popular internet media. And so that's why I chose the landscape of looking at memes. So for example, the four predominant tropes in the controlling images frameworks are the mammy, the idea that, women serve as kind of like the docile caretaker for all. And you can see that in the image on the bottom right. The Jezebel, this idea or concept that Black women are, you know, promiscuous or sexually loose. The matriarch, which is this stereotype that Black women are overbearing or domineering. And then also the welfare queen, which we know comes out of a late 80s kind of like right-wing Republican spin on welfare cheats in society. Like, it's a completely made up trope that was used to kind of push welfare reform in the late 80s, but Black women became like the impetus, and I'm not the impetus, but the main focus of that. So I found out of the 400 memes that I analyzed, the overwhelming majority of them track back onto at least one of these 4 tropes. And I just want to share an example here that I have of, sorry, I have the wrong language on this slide, but if you just focus on the image there, this is from Justin Richberg, which is a artist who, this is supposed to just be just this image. I'm so sorry, these slides are messed up. But he has a lot of art that he does depicting Black women. And this is one of the examples kind of the matriarch stereotype, where this woman is fighting to pay for the check or pay for the bill. And we see kind of this coming up over and over again as a theme within the analysis. When I initially did the coding, I kind of just did a hand emergent coding scheme, literally coding for everything I could find. Giphy is a platform that allowed me to tag everything from skin color to what they were wearing, to what they were saying, to what they were doing. And within that, I noticed this other framework that could be used to categorize them as well. So I coded them twice. I coded them once with an emergency coding scheme, and I coded them again against the controlling images framework, which yielded kind of all of these traditional tropes. And within that also I found, I can't believe these slides are like this. They both have the same language. I'm sorry about that. It's supposed to be just the images here. I also found like an inversion of feminist ideology within that, Black feminist ideology. You see a lot of these people in this subset of the internet basically co-opting terms from Black feminism and using them against them. So an example here is the caption on one of the memes, and it says, hell no, these politicians love playing the intersectionality game while they ignore Black issues and cape for everyone else. And in this, intersectionality is misused as a way that, misused as a theory that takes away from conversations around Blackness, when intersectionality is actually the reverse. It's actually supposed to broaden the conversation around Blackness to include women, feminine presenting people. But we continue to see this kind of ambient surveillance of Black feminist ideology within this community. Another example is the next quote, where it was a post about Gayle King, and the caption says, "Gayle King is out here mammy-splaining right now," which I thought was really interesting because it not only co-opts the term mansplaining, which comes out of the feminist tradition, but it also calls her a mammy, which is one of these stereotypical tropes that I found coming up over and over again in this research. So in this, and we see this over and over again, like the use of the term toxic masculinity, misogyny, and things like that. So in this dissertation, I introduced the concept of network misogynoir to kind of describe what this subset of the community is engaged in. It's kind of also describes how the technical affordances of social media platforms support the social connection of individuals who are opposed to Black women and oftentimes Black feminists, and also facilitate the reactionary online backlash to Black women and Black feminists in particular. This term merges key literatures from several communication scholars, including Wellman and Laney's concept of what it means to be networked, the different ways in which we connect socially in a networked society, as Castells would say. It also merges Dr. Sarah Benet Weiser's concept of popular misogyny, which describes the way in which popular yet reductive conceptions of feminism circulate in popular culture. And of course, Dr. Moya Bailey and Trudy's concept of misogynoir. Misogynoir is a term that is used to describe a distinct form of gendered or sexist anti-Blackness that targets Black women specifically. Dr. Moya Bailey coined the term alongside Trudy, and it's a portmanteau of the words misogyny, which means the hatred of women, and noir, which is the French word for Black. Misogynoir, therefore, quite literally translates to the hatred of Black women. And I argue in this dissertation that these communities are forming around this mutual shared hatred. And this is not simply, this is not reduced to one gender of people. There's women that are also involved in this community. And I think when we bring this to the center, we can kind of get a more holistic understanding of what is happening when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and targeted harassment in these spaces. And, you know, I want to be clear, again, the contents of the meme aggregator pages that I looked at, they are literally a part of a subset within the Black digital public sphere. This is in no way a representation of how the overwhelming majority of Black people are talking about Black women online. The subset is actually a group that is kind of colloquial term like FOTEPs, which harkens back to a group of kind of Black nationalists and Pan-Africanist folks, but there's in this digital iteration, we see kind of like a collapsed version of their ideology that is more anti-Semitic, homophobic, and all these different things. And that's the focus of my dissertation. But in this specific chapter of it, I identify what this community is and their proximity to the white manosphere. In centering, in this centering of women of color's experience, women of color and Black women's experiences in particular, intersectionality is a powerful means of revealing the normative workings of power and ubiquitous technological systems. That is, if technological systems are value-laden with white heteronormative patriarchal values, the process of entangling and decolonizing technology may require an approach that incorporates alternative epistemologies, intersectionality being one. Where Crenshaw employs the concept of intersectionality to make visible, glaring oversights that facilitate marginalization within the legal system, critical intersectional technology researchers have employed intersectionality to do the same for other technological systems and processes. For these researchers, it has served as a framework for uncovering, understanding, and naming the inability of technological systems to register certain marginalized groups and consequent harm against those rendered invisible by these systems. By putting marginality at the center of analysis in our research projects in particular, by foregrounding the experiences of women of color in these technological regimes, we reveal the normative standards in these systems going beyond inputs and outputs to inner workings. So again, this conversation about how we can ask new questions with technology is kind of my, this is how I insert myself into these conversations about AI for social good. I'm thinking about the ways in which we can employ some of these critical ideologies, these critical theories of race, Black feminism, as a way to kind of ask new questions of the technology and what that will yield in the research results. And just a shameless plug, I continue these conversations on intersectional approaches to internet studies in a forthcoming edited volume, Intersectional Internet, Power, Politics, and Resistance Online. The book is co-edited by Dr. Sophia Noble and Dr. Sarah T. Roberts of the UCLA's Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, as well as Sulafa Zadani, who is a PhD candidate at USC Edinburgh, and she'll be joining the Comparative Media Studies faculty at MIT in the fall. And I hope you will be looking out for that book so we can continue this conversation about how to use intersectional approaches to critical internet studies. Thank you.
Thank you for that very powerful talk. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Dura Demski is a fourth-year PhD student in linguistics at Stanford, advised by Dan Jurevsky. Her research focuses on developing natural language processing methods to support student-centered education. Her recent publication focused on analyzing the representations of historically marginalized groups in US history textbooks, and on measuring teachers' optics of student ideas in classroom discourse. She's currently leading a project studying the effectiveness of providing linguistic feedback to teachers using NLP. Please welcome Dura Demski to present her talk, Content Analysis of Textbooks via Natural Language Processing, Findings on Gender, Race, and Ethnicity in Texas US History Textbooks.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here, and I'll be discussing my recent work on the content analysis of textbooks using natural language processing, which is also related to my dissertation topic on using natural language processing to support student-centered education. This work was done in collaboration with Lucy Lee, Tricia Bromley, and Ben Jarevsky. Textbooks are the most widely used instructional technology around the world. They convey social and cultural values to students and impact their beliefs about people and ethnicities different from themselves. But textbooks are not neutral, and one research area in education is to understand how people are portrayed in varying ways in these books. Most textbook content analyses rely on people reading and hand coding textbook. For example, a coding protocol might ask questions about how often a social group is mentioned and whether they talked about in the context of topics such as human rights. These traditional methods tend to lack precision and be resource intensive. We focus on textbooks from Texas, which has the second largest student population in the US, with 5.4 million students enrolled in its K-12 public school system in 2017. Texas is a major textbook market for publishers, and so the state has a significant influence on the US textbook content. Texas has also been at the center of several controversies. In 2015, a new social studies textbook adoption was launched. This curriculum became a subject of many news headlines, and some of the articles stated that the curriculum promoted conservative ideas. The goal of our work is to apply NLP, or natural language processing, to answer questions that textbook researchers in education care about. We focus on three main research questions, which are inspired by related work in education. The first one is, how much are different groups of people mentioned in these books? The second is how different groups and individuals described in these books. And third, which topics are prominent and how do they relate to groups of people? In this talk, I'll only focus on the first two in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer questions related to the third research question after the talk. We focus on American history textbooks purchased in Texas between 2015 and 2017 for middle and high school students. We obtained textbook purchase data from the website of the Texas Board of Education, then performed a lot of manual cleanup and disambiguation to standardize the textbook titles, and kept the 15 most widely purchased textbooks. This includes combined volumes that come from the same series. We ordered and scanned these books manually, except for those 7 that were available on PDFs online. And we then applied the Abifine Reader, a software for performing optical character recognition on this data, and used the resulting text with very minimal post-processing for an analysis. I want to introduce a running example from one of our textbooks to illustrate our methods and analyses. Our first research question addresses how different groups of people are mentioned in textbooks. We applied coreference resolution so that references to the same people or person would be counted together. We also identified common nouns that designate non-named people, such as pioneer or Mexicans. Our way to do this is to extract all hyponyms of human, person, people, or social group in WordNet, which is a lexical database for English. We use named entity recognition to pull our words designating named individuals. We standardize names using their official name from Wikidata and focus our analyses on the top 100 most common named entity recognized terms. Our list of common nouns include unmarked terms such as engineer or family, as well as terms specifying a demographic, which we determined manually. We also consider cases of intersectionality, such as Black women, which would be categorized as both women and Black. For named entities, we use Wikidata to identify their gender, but had to identify race using manual inspection because race wasn't always listed for white people. Previous work has emphasized the importance of culturally relevant education, such as students seeing their personal identities represented in the school curriculum. The plot compares the percentage of people marked by race and ethnicity across books against Texas student demographics. The red bar for Latinx, which corresponds to Texas students, is much higher than the peach bar for common nouns marked as Latinx in textbooks. This means that these students are disproportionately underrepresented in these books. Blacks and white people are mentioned the most often in textbooks. White people are actually mentioned more often in text than this plot shows, and that's because the assumed demographic for most people-related nouns is the dominant group if they're unmarked. For example, if the text discusses farmers, their focus is actually white farmers, even though it's not explicitly stated. This plot shows the percentages of people marked by gender. Men are mentioned more often than women, while student percentages are roughly equal. We do not expect to see a representation that is directly proportional to student demographics, but the distinctions we find provide empirical information for future research on how and why curricula shaped students. The most common named person in our text was Andrew Jackson, followed by Thomas Jefferson, and the 20-something most common people include many more politicians. Now, when we finally get to the 28th most common famous person, we finally get one woman, Eleanor Roosevelt. She's actually the only woman within the 50 most common named people across our textbooks. This is consistent with previous findings where she also tended to be the most prominent woman in textbooks. She's followed by Barack Obama, Martin Luther King, who are the two of the 4 Black people in the top 50. The other Black individuals are Dred Scott and Frederick Douglass. This just shows that the amount of space allotted to famous people featured in history textbooks tend to be reserved for a single demographic with a few exceptions. This plot shows that textbook purchased in more conservative counties have fewer mentions of Black people. The x-axis is how democratic the counties are that purchased each textbook, and the y-axis is the percentage of people in textbooks that are categorized under some demographic. State-adopted textbooks are represented by triangles, and then they tend to be purchased in more conservative counties. Similarly, textbooks that are purchased in more conservative counties also mention women less frequently. It was difficult for us to generate similar graphs for Hispanic and Latinx people, since they showed up with very low frequency across all textbooks. Now we move on to our second research question, which is how are different groups and individuals described in these books? For example, previous work showed that women occurred less agentive and more passive verbs than men in Afghani history textbooks. We perform a similar analysis automatically. We use dependency parsing to extract adjectives and verbs associated with named people or common nouns referring to people. Relations we use include the subject of verbs, adjectives, subjects of passive verbs, and direct objects. We use lexicon-based approaches on the extracted verbs and adjectives to look at their affective and social connotations. We apply NRC's valence, arousal, and dominance lexicon on adjectives. For example, amazing has high valence, asleep has low arousal, and competitive has high dominance. We also applied connotation frame lexicon on verbs. Using connotation frames for agency, we assign verbs numerical scores of 1, 0, or -1, depending on whether the subject of a verb has high, neutral, or low agency, respectively. An example of a low agency verb is obeys. We did something similar for power, depending on whether the person is the subject or the object of the verb. For example, for the verb applauds, the subject has low power, while the object has high power. These plots compare categories of people and their power and agency connotation frame scores. The named entity category includes the top 100 named individuals. The other categories refer to categories of common nouns associated with people. Black people are the subject or object of verbs with less power and agency. These differences are largely due to the appearance of Black people in the context of slavery and racial oppression. For example, they are the object of high power verbs such as owned and barred. Named individuals have the highest agency and power, which is reasonable because many perform actions related to politics. They tend to veto or initiate. We also employed a word embedding based method to look at how people are framed in textbooks. Word embeddings are learned from word co-occurrence patterns in large corpora, and they're the standard way of representing word meaning in natural language processing. We learned embeddings for unigrams and bigrams in textbooks, and with this so-called glove method. Cosine similarity is the standard method for measuring the semantic similarity of words in the embedding space. We examine the cosine similarity between terms of different genders and words related to work, home, and achievement. This plot shows the results for our word embedding based analyses. The x-axis represents the average cosine similarity of a particular word to man-related terms, and the y-axis represents the average cosine similarity of a particular word to women-related terms. The colors show the category that the word belongs to. Home-related terms are more closely related to women with very high significance. Women are also more closely associated with work-related terms than men. This result is actually consistent with that of Schmidt, who found that the greatest number of references to women occur in the context of the workplace in recent US history curricula. And most, but not all, achievement-related terms are significantly closer as to man-related terms, especially ones related to power and control. To summarize, our first research question was, how much are different groups and people mentioned in textbooks? We used coreference resolution, named entity recognition, and WordNet, and found that Latinx people are virtually absent in these books. Named people are mainly white men, and that there's a better representation in books but in more democratic counties. Second, we asked, how are different groups and individuals described in these books? We used NRC lexicons, connotation frames, and word embeddings, and found that women are discussed in the context of marriage, home, and work more than men, and that Black people have low agency, power, and dominance. The third question I didn't touch on, but as I said, I'm happy to answer questions. And all our code and the toolkit is available on GitHub if anyone is interested in using it for their own research. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you for sharing that very detailed and comprehensive work. Our final speaker today is Randi Williams. Randi Williams is a third-year PhD student in Personal Robots Group at the MIT Media Lab. She received her Master's of Science in Media Arts and Sciences from MIT in 2018 and her Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering from UMBC in 2016. Her research intersects human-robot interaction and education with a particular focus on engaging students from underrepresented communities in technology. Her current project, How to Train Your Robot, she's working with educators to design AI curricula that teach AI concepts through hands-on projects related to current issues. You can learn more about her past and ongoing projects on her MIT Media Lab webpage. And with that, please welcome Randi Williams to present her talk, How to Train Your Robot, Envisioning the Future of Education.
Thank you so much, Herman. This has been extremely exciting already, so I'm happy to share, but also excited to engage with the other speakers. So hello, my name is Randi Williams. I'm currently a PhD student at MIT. Today I'll be sharing I'll be talking a lot about my project, How to Train Your Robot, but also just kind of broadly thinking about what is the future of education and how can AI play a role in that. And I'd like to get started with the story. This is told often by the current president of University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is where I did undergrad. And he talks about how when he was a child, his parents and grandparents would engage with him about how his day went after school, but they wouldn't ask the typical question, what did you learn in school today? No, they would ask, I think, a very unique and interesting question, which is, did you ask any good questions today? And so I love that idea. I love framing and thinking about the world in terms of like the questions that you're asking. And so that's how I'm kind of going to present my talk, by sharing with you all some of the questions that I'm asking and trying to answer in various ways. So the first question is a how question. Specifically, how is AI shaping children's relationships with technology? Well, there's a lot of ways to answer this question, but sort of the summarized version is first that AI is taking over. So when I started doing this work in 2018, there were about 16% of homes that had a smart virtual voice assistant of some kind in their homes. Mind you, the first voice assistants came out in 2014, so already pretty good penetration there. Then in 2020, 2 years later, that has increased to 24%. And the authors of the report who shared that were like, well, it's only getting more like large with the sort of COVID lockdowns and things like that. So it's grown quite quickly in only a few years. And so we're in a space where a lot of children have interacted with AI in some way. It's not like a computer where you have to learn how to read and write. Now these devices can talk to you. The second way that I see AI kind of shaping students' lives is in changing the way that they think and relate to the world. And of course, that's through social media. Certainly it impacts us. If you think about the advertisements that you're shown, influencers, and how the algorithms behind a lot of news feeds sort of promote certain content and bury other content, the ways that our psychology is linked to likes and reactions and things like that, all of it certainly changes the way that adults relate to technology, but it also has important impacts on children. And then finally, there's just what happens when you put a child with technology, like what's going on there. Well, I've done some research in that, and it's not surprising to find out that children have formed and are forming social and emotional connections with technology. And it's partially because humans are just wired that way to interact socially, but it's also because the technology is designed that way. It seems to be intelligent, it's very expressive, it has these personas and names. And so children come to think of technology as something that's intelligent and that they can trust, and maybe that they even love. And you know, that's not too bad, the pervasiveness and persuasiveness and effectiveness of technology, except that AI is not an entity in and of itself. It is owned and operated and developed by companies. And so the big question that I have is, well, if powerful companies are in control of this, and if it's sort of commodified, what impact might that have on our ability to function as society? And I think a good way to start approaching that is to ask this what if question, meaning if we don't want our society to sort of be controlled in negative ways by technology and commodification, what if we found ways to have more people engage with the creation and understanding of AI? And that brings How to Train Your Robot. So How to Train Your Robot is a middle school AI and ethics curriculum. The goal was to take all of the cool things, some of the things that you all have talked about already, and lots of work that I've seen at MIT, and to literally bring it into public school classrooms, primarily focusing on Title I classrooms. And the reason being because public school classrooms often get these opportunities last, but they're very, very diverse spaces where you can really engage with the fullness of the American public. There's a link to the website because all the materials and things are free. And so using How to Train Your Robot as sort of the basis, I'm going to talk about some ways that we can think about reshaping education, specifically computer science and technology education, so that more people can engage and create with AI. The first way is by lowering barriers to access. So before we even can really talk about AI education, you know, what's going on with CS education? Right now, like less than 50% of United States high schools, I actually think it's like shockingly low, but I forget the number off the top of my head. But very few children have the opportunity to learn about computer science in their K-12 experience. And the main reasons for that are A, it costs too much, B, there are not appropriate materials available all of the time, and C, teachers need training and that is not available. And so in response to that, those are some of the things that How to Train Your Robot immediately addresses. So there's a written curriculum, which is like 200 pages, as well as a series of training videos that scaffold AI content knowledge. So it gives teachers the background that they need to actually dive into AI with their classes. And then there's training that talks about pedagogical knowledge. How do you explain the difference between a traditional algorithm and an AI algorithm by using things like recipes, for example, to make it more accessible to students. All of the materials are free, and because we're working with Title I teachers that often have the fewest resources, we provide any extra things like devices that they may need for free, and we pay teachers to actually participate in the training. So all of the incentives to get involved and try it. Another way that we lower barriers is we create interfaces for people to build AI that are slightly less scary. So the ground floor for How to Train Your Robot is your teacher is going to teach it. You don't have to know how to program. You don't have to have any prior background in AI. This is the interface that we're using. It's based on Scratch, which is a very popular programming language. And it's block-based. It's extremely interactive. You can like music, songs, all kinds of things are jumping around the screen very quickly. But also this version runs in a browser. You need like the lowest possible bandwidth of internet to get it running. It doesn't talk to external AI engines. And so all of that just makes it something that's rather easy for schools to do, especially because during the pandemic, a lot of students were given laptops to work with. So it's actually like just about right for reaching most schools. And so talking about that programming interface, that brings us to the second thing, that learning should be active. It shouldn't feel like a lecture where people are talking to you. It should be something hands-on. So this curriculum is built in the spirit of constructionism, which just sort of says that your prior knowledge and the experiences that you have are the basis on which you can build new knowledge. And I think it's extremely empowering, because when you're diving into something like AI and students may feel like, oh, I can't do that, or only experts can do that, really engaging students' prior knowledge and then giving them a set of intentional experiences and reflecting on that to build knowledge helps them very personally connect to things. So coming back to that interface, the topic, or the main topic of How to Train Your Robot, it's only a week long, is supervised machine learning, as well as some topics in like general, what is AI and what is ethics? This is the interface that they can use to train a text classification model. So right now you can see the training for Drive. It needs very few examples because it's built on top of another model that uses transfer learning, so they don't have to come up with hundreds of examples. Then they can do cool things like this, where they talk to their robot, say things like, it's too dark, and it figures out, oh, you want me to turn the lights on. So students can very quickly have a lot of fun with that. I apologize for not showing pictures of my students. I'm very protective of them and pictures of their faces, but I promise you they do it too. They have a lot of fun. Here's another example where a student could recreate a Snapchat filter that recognizes when they open and close their mouth. And yeah, also using like very few programming blocks in order to do that. So when we do this, when we have students actually engage in understanding, but building artificial intelligence as well, we don't just want them to think, okay, great, technology is awesome, go off and save the world. We actually want them to think pretty critically about how AI is a socio-technical system, meaning that every step of the way, design, development, deployment, there is something that's happening that's not objective. So maybe a better way to say this is to put it in the framing that we give students. So we have them build a pizza delivery app, and students may walk in with the, oh, there's only one right answer, algorithms go and find that right answer. But as they're developing this algorithm for pizza delivery, we restrict them in certain ways, like you can only ask a certain amount of questions and their binary options. They quickly find that there is no such thing as an objective algorithm. All algorithms are very highly designed by the humans that play a role in making them. And furthermore, when you're designing something, there are stakeholders involved. So if we're talking about a pizza delivery app, stakeholders could be the person who's actually interacting with the smart speaker to order the pizza, as well as other people who may eat the pizza in the app user's home, and the pizza maker, the company that has to make money. And so we have students consider, what are the most important things to all of these different stakeholders? Are there any constraints or places where you cannot satisfy everyone's needs? The answer is often yes. And so how do you make design decisions according to that? And if you make a particular decision, how does that impact everyone else, and how will you justify that? And so we ask students to think very systematically through how they design what they design, and why they design it that way. And then after they've done that, sort of looking into themselves on toy projects, we ask them to look out into the world. So this actually comes from a different curriculum, but we have students redesign YouTube and think about things like, okay, if you have a feature that pops up and says, hey, your screen time has been super long today, it's time to take a break. That might be something that parents of children really love, something that YouTube, the company, loves less because they make less money. And so we encourage students to sort of engage with that in a very deep way and think about, well, even if YouTube makes technically less money, maybe parents will be more likely to allow their child to use YouTube if it has this kind of feature. So, it can sort of like subvert and stack up. Or maybe they're like, money making isn't the goal here. Maybe users are more important. And it's great to see middle school students wrestle with these kinds of ideas. A lot of them are very motivated by making money. And so those three things, the low barrier to access, active learning, and embedded ethics, I would say are sort of completed work. We've been doing this for about 2 years and have had hundreds of students and dozens of teachers around the country actually use the materials. Sorry that I don't have time to present like the results of that, but not only do we see children building things, but we also see them building things very thoughtfully. And most of the children are like a huge percentage of female students and huge percentage of students of color who are engaging with this. So my hope is that it's going to sort of change the face of AI. The last thing, just because I'm in a personal robots group, and some people may not know what a social robot is we don't just want the technology to exist as it is as like a static website. A lot of the work that we do in the personal robots group is designing social robots and social robot interactions that scaffold learning gains and learning outcomes like this. So this is Ariana, she's 5 and she's learning how to read. But what the robot is doing is it's encouraging her to be more resilient. She looked kind of sad when the video started, and the robot's encouraging her and bringing her back in and having her pay attention. So we're curious about the ways that this technology could be added to an AI curriculum. And then also I've used social robots like this one, Hotbots, to literally teach 3-year-olds about AI. They could not read yet, but I was very sure that if we could have a social robot sort of explain what it was thinking, this is a supervised machine learning example, then students would be able to engage with it and understand, and they did. So that is all I have about time to share with today, but you can access the slides by going to the tiny URL link, and I'm excited to engage with you all in the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. That was very interesting that you support AI learning from the ground up. I think there's a clear value to that. Well, everyone, please share your round of applause to Amber, Brooklyne, Dora, and Randy 1-4. And please feel free to ask your questions in the panel. And before we start taking questions, I have a big overarching question for our panel. The question is, what are some of the important lessons in AI for social good that you have learned from your work? I think we can start with Amber.
Okay. Can you ask me that question again?
Sure. Yeah. What are some of the important lessons in AI for social good that you've learned from your work? And take your time.
Yeah. I think it's that I think I'll go back to the essence of my talk in that, like, what we say matters, right? And in particular, like my motivation for wanting to look at the statements from platforms is because of what I've been trying to understand is how then those beliefs help them govern online platforms, right? How they influence how they construct content moderation policies or other rules of engagement, right? And so I think that like we have to talk about hard issues. We have to talk about social inequalities in ways that actually point toward the systems of oppression that exist in the world.
Thank you.
And just like going off of what Amber is saying about making systems visible, I personally feel like intersectionality, as I shared in my talk, is a way that we can make systems more visible. Like technoculture is, hegemonic, is white, it's heteronormative. And this is a way, by centering the people who are at the margins, bringing them into the center is a way to kind of showcase how these symptoms might manifest some of these harmful discourses, I guess we can say. So I feel like from my research, what I've most learned is that the questions we ask are important. The categories we use to classify things are very important. So how can we engage with critical scholars to ask better or different questions?
Dora?
Yeah. So I think for me, I think it's really interesting that very often when we talk about AI and society, we often mean how people interact with AI, which is probably the most important part. But I think also there's the other angle, which is how can we use AI to actually capture and identify and quantify the biases in our data? Because on top of because the sort of nature of AI that it is trained on data that is biased, has this it allows it to also kind of capture it. And I think if we really try to zoom in on that, I think we can really learn about our own societal biases, which I think is a very promising and important direction. Yeah.
Randi?
Yeah, I like the answer Dora, sort of talking about AI as like the dark mirror reflecting back who we are to ourselves. I think I've honestly been wrestling a lot, sort of like Brooklyn was saying, about engaging with critical scholars more to do this work. I think the biggest thing I'm realizing is that I do not have all the tools in the toolbox to do this work, but being an engineer, computer science person, they constantly tell you that you do. They're like, oh yeah, you can totally build it. Tech can do it. We can solve society. And so kind of that reality check being something that I've encountered a lot in my work, and also that I try to teach students, you can build really cool things. You might not be able to build the perfect, really cool thing. And so, yeah, there's a question of how do we sort of change the way that we engage with it.
And that might be another potential point that is so important, collaboration between scholars who might be on the more computer science tech side and someone who might be on the more critical humanities side. Obviously, so many of us do a little bit of both, but we can't do everything. So how can we collaborate more often? How can we inform one another's work? I think that's an important question as well.
Totally.
There's a question for Amber. The question was from Sifa here, and the question was whether racist acts is due to subconscious biases in which race and color are an essential part, and how can we separate the idea of race from racist acts? And I would like to expand that question a little bit. It seems like the takeaway from your excellent talk, Amber, is that it's really important to name the actors that creates and preserve racism, and how, as well as describing the process of racism in which it creates discrimination. And I was wondering if that's enough or whether we should push more beyond that.
Yeah, let me read it. Yeah, so So I want to be clear here that like, it is important to name who the actors are, but I think that we ought to be careful there, because like that then plays into this notion that if that like it's that racism is a result of individual actions, that if we just fix or get rid of that one person, then racism goes away, and that's not that's not real, right? All racist actions exist within a structure of anti-Black racism in US society, right? And so, into this question, is it when an individual engages in a racist act, is it due to subconscious bias, of which race and color are an essential part? Yes, but it's not necessarily simply about the color of someone's skin, right? Like if you engage in a racist action, you might be doing it against a Black person, but you're not simply doing it because their skin is Black or brown, right? You are doing it because you have been embedded in a culture which teaches you that Black people are somehow less than, right? And that they have deficient characteristics that that you don't want to be associated with, right? So like, and sometimes sometimes that bias is subconscious, sometimes it's sometimes it's overt, and sometimes the person is actively meaning to discriminate against people who are Black or brown or the racial minorities. And so we can't separate the idea of race from racist actions, because the very idea of racial categories is rooted in racism, right? Like you don't actually get racial categories without racism, right? Because racial categories function as a way to place some people in a superordinate position and place other people in a subordinate position.
Right, thank you. I have a second question for Brooklyn. And when you shared all the memes in one of your slides, there was a meme about welfare queen, and I remember that racist ideas was applied systematically by some actors, and then on the other hand, we know that memes are often they came out naturally, right? People just create them for fun, and I was wondering if you have any insight whether this misogyny or memes were they part of a systematic approach, or does this comes out naturally from like a racist society? And it's okay if you don't have either. Sorry.
Can you clarify what you mean about does it come up as a system? I mean, you mean is this a part of the system of racism, or what are you saying?
Or is it part of a systematic campaign to discriminate Black people in the US?
Okay,
it's
well,
okay if you did it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit of both. I mean, one of the big concerns when I was doing this research is the prevalence of sock puppet accounts and interference in Black public sphere conversations. So I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but there are a lot of people who will present as Black women online to kind of infiltrate these discourses and have conversations, which is why I kept my sample to a subset of folks that I was already familiar with, that I know specifically are not bots, are not sock puppets either. But I think the point of the larger project in showcasing how anti-Blackness can manifest in Black spaces was more so to go toward the end of kind of what Amber was talking about, in the way that we have to stop pointing at people and specific things and start thinking about the broader discourses and ideologies. We know that white men are the #1 perpetrators and the producers of these harmful discourses, but there's a way in which these discourses go across all communities, including the communities that the discourse is against. And that's really powerful, because it stops us from doing that thing of thinking, oh, well, I'm not anti-Black, I'm this. I'm not anti-Black, I'm that. It's like, well, no, this is a discourse that everyone can take up. And we need to start pointing out what that discourse is, what that ideology is, what it actually looks like, as opposed to coming up with like these kind of reductive categories for identifying it. So I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but I think that it is a part of a system. It's not necessarily happening in the subset that I looked at, the sample that I looked at. It's not a specific targeted thing. I think these are people just coming together, making jokes, sharing memes, laughing and talking, but it shows you a little bit more about how these discourses are kind of all over the place. They're just in the water.
Right. Thank
Can
you
I
for
ask
the
a follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah, so both to Amber and Brooklyne, I really loved your presentations. And one thing that I really loved about them is how you brought these very sort of seemingly subtle, like linguistic examples and like tropes to highlight some of the like very systemic problems of how we interact, like how this discourse is happening. And I sort of was wondering if you think that, you know, if we brought such examples to people's attention, like very concretely, like Amber's first example, for example, about the segregation, like, do you think, you know, it could address or help people like become aware of these things? Or like, how do you think people could become aware of?
Hey, Dora, you want my real answer? That's the frustrating thing about this work, right? Like, I feel like historically, I think about, you know, and Amber, you'll speak to this better than me, sociologists of the past who did everything to showcase what systemic racism looked like, everything bent over backwards. And yet and still, you know, the systems of racism maintain themselves by ignoring, you know, the prevalence of racism, right? You know, when I'm teaching about intersectionality in my classroom, I often get students who ask me, can a white male have an intersectional identity if they're, you know, a part of the LGBTQ community or less able? And I'm like, I was like, that question is an example of what intersectionality is trying to do. And that's, you know, correct that, you know, diversion. We always want to not talk about Black people. We always want to not talk about Black women. So my honest answer is like, yes, this research can definitely be used to showcase and really highlight, you know, these biases, but people only see as much as they want to see. So I don't know, you know, I'm here, I'm doing the work. I don't know, Amber, you might have different thoughts.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, so Jennifer Mueller, who's a scholar at Skidmore College, has done some really great work and she has a theory, the theory of white racial ignorance. Right. And the basic proposition is that like white people are aware, they know what racism is and they know why it's bad and they know how it shows up. They just choose to ignore it because of the benefits they get by doing so, right? And so yeah, I entirely agree with Brooklyn. Like the premise of my work is not that platforms don't understand what they're doing. It's just that they don't care and they don't think that we're smart enough to see it. And so I don't think it's a problem of awareness, right? Like, I'm thinking of like the consciousness raising work of the 1960s of the civil rights movement, right? Like where people are just like, hey, like these are our experiences, right? And like some people genuinely like do need to be educated, right? Like I'm not saying that that's not true, right? But again, if we're talking structurally and systematically, right? Like people know that racism exists and they know linguistically like what they're doing when they refuse, for example, to say Black people, but instead subsume it into just people of color, right? Like people know what they're doing in those moments, and they're just strategically deploying that ignorance to uphold their own, to uphold white supremacy.
Thank you for the great discussion. This is really insightful. I have a question asked anonymously for Dora. So the question is, thank you so much for demonstrating quantitatively how underrepresented US history textbooks are towards the minority groups. And in your work, how do you interpret biases in connotative language for power? So for example, when US history is rife with systemic power imbalances, would you say that there are better ways to present this history? And
go ahead. That's a really good question. So we only analyzed textbooks that had that were like at least I think 10 purchases, like 10 districts used those textbooks. So these are actually like not necessarily the most like, you know, progressive or like not the best textbook examples probably. Like there are actually like projects including like facing history, and like there are other and there's also the People's History of the United States, like examples of projects and books that are presenting history in a different way. Sort of not like, I think like there's this distinction, for example, really focusing on political history, which is essentially like the history of power, and that's gonna just involve white people, like white politicians' history, and not the people's history. And I think like if you kind of have to fundamentally change the perspective to talk about people and not about power, and I think that that would be one way, and there are good examples for sure for doing that.
Thank you for the answer. I have a question for Randy. You know, I can see that many people here can see themselves someday teaching AI for children. And I was wondering, coming from a constructivist teaching philosophy, I was wondering what are the best strategies to teach AI to children?
Oh, wow.
I think you have a lot of experience in that.
Yeah, I think the best strategy is to give students more credit than you want to. Because I've seen like lots of projects that explain AI with a video, or encourage students to make a project, but like they sort of set what the project is. But what I loved about all of these talks was I was like literally writing down like, oh yeah, I think I can get middle school kids to like, you know, look at what tech companies are posting and like analyze that critically, or go through their textbooks and understand like how conversations around power and gender are being had. And the thing is like students want to do that. And so any way that you can allow students to sort of set the direction of their work, and then B, give them like all of the tools that you can to allow them to do that well, I think is the best way to teach them AI. So like a lot of the other curricula that I didn't get to talk about, like we're just gonna do a dancing thing, and then like, whoops, we slipped the AI in accidentally, but then students go and do like, you know, much more than dancing when they finish, like they're thinking about like COVID-19 and how to get people to move and things like that. So yeah, just really acknowledging like the ability that students have to make an impact, and bringing like the fullness of your work to them and letting them grapple with it, as opposed to trying to like put them in a playpen. Yeah, I think that works very well.
Thank you for sharing that strategies. I mean, I think that would be really useful for everyone here. I think we're almost reaching the end of this wonderful and insightful seminar, and I'm going to just invite all of the panels to share their final thoughts in the space of AI for social good before we wrap up. Amber, do you want to start again?
Yeah. That's a good prompt.
And feel free to take your time.
Yeah, I think I often feel, you know, and I said this, you know, I touched on this when I was talking, I often feel pessimistic about the future of AI, and how and not even just the future of AI particularly, but how we use it, right? And who we're giving power to make decisions. I don't like that Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Jack Dorsey have so much power. I don't like that. But I also don't like the idea of people like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and other bad actors wresting control from them, right? So I feel, you know, so I'm often, I often find myself like wondering what the solution is. And I don't know, right? Like people much smarter than me are are thinking about this topic. But like we've got to do something, right? Because like this model's untenable. And it has shown that time and time again. And I think that whatever that work is, it has to include, scholars like, the people on this panel and folks who are thinking about these sorts of issues. And also, I'm thinking about like folks like Joan Donovan, who is like brilliant, right? Like, and who just like does such great work. Right, it has to include like, the technologists and the academics who are thinking about these issues.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm definitely gonna echo Amber and also repeat myself from earlier about on the collaboration piece of folks from all different disciplines coming together on these issues, because when we're thinking about technology in society and using AI for social good, we have to think about the questions we're asking, we have to think about the tools we're developing, who we're pointing them out, we have to think about power. And so we can't do that, just from one discipline or the other. We kind of have to collaborate, more on some of those things. So that's kind of my thing. I'm always pushing for more like collaboration between technologists and like critical scholars.
Dora?
Yes, I echo everything that was said before me. And I think, like, first of all, like, people becoming aware. I think that that Randi's work, for example, of like really making, like, I think that currently one of the way that people hold power over AI is really by like preventing people to know what it's doing and like really accessing it. And I think that that if we really held these people in power accountable, first of all, it would be nice if they didn't have as much power, but I think also like making it accessible and democratizing AI would be a really important thing to sort of handle these problems about fairness and I just shared this documentary here that I would definitely recommend on this topic, which I learned from. And I think, there are a lot of efforts and movements out there, and if we really like know about them and support them, that's also a way we can engage with this issue, I think.
And for me, I think the biggest thing that I've learned in this work is that even though I walk in teaching AI classes to teachers who teach AI classes, I don't expect every person in the room to become necessarily an AI engineer. And I think in doing this work, that's an important perspective to have, which is that the work is not ever one thing. It is both understanding companies and holding them accountable and looking at textbooks and education and what we're giving our students and asking for that to be better, and looking at how we talk to one another on social media. And it's, teaching kids about the things that we do every day, and it's 20 other things. So for me, the most encouraging thing is to just really commit to doing what I do well at a high level, and making sure that other people have opportunities to enter into that. Because ultimately, Amber's right, the problem's insane. I don't know how it's gonna fix itself, but many hands and all that. Many hands make light work. So I'm definitely encouraged by just all the varieties of work that are here. And if you're interested in teaching kids about some of the cool AI you do, definitely find me, because I would love to talk more about that.
Well, thank you for everyone. We've been talking about difficult topics today, and my hope is that this panel, and among many other, will be a fertile ground for future collaboration in which we can together and collaboratively counter injustices in this society. And please share your applause with our panel today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.